Be honest with me. Have you ever stepped into a place, some rotting, dilapidated log cabin in the corner of the woods, or a desolate tract of wilderness, and felt instantaneously that you were entirely unwelcome? Not necessarily the threat of imminent violence or the prickling sensation of someone lurking with an axe aimed at the nape of your neck. It is more insidious, more cruel than that, simply unwelcome. It is as though the very earth beneath your feet is holding its breath, writhing invisibly, commanding your footsteps to fall silent and merely waiting for you to leave so that it might return to its primordial, undisturbed stillness. If you have ever experienced that spine-chilling sensation, some tangible place in this world that forced you to turn on your heel and walk away without understanding why, throw that location into the comments below. I never miss a single line, and over time I have come to realize a bitter truth. The places that haunt the human psyche the most tenaciously are almost never the bolded bottlenecks marked on famous maps. They are the voids, speaking of which, when you hear me mention gloomy mountain ranges, where pale, reclusive clans dwell in total isolation from American civilization, where does your brain automatically jump to? The mystique of the Appalachians on the East Coast, with their skin-crawling folklore, right? Drop the name that just popped into your head in the comments, and let's see if we are walking to the same rhythm. But the truth is, tonight we are not heading toward the East Coast. We are going to plunge deep into the dark heart of the Ozark Mountains. Devil's Den State Park in Arkansas is today a breathtaking tourist destination. It is meticulously planned. There are paved parking lots, pressed wood picnic tables, and golden leaf-strewn trails punctuated by mile markers. But in the autumn of 1881, this area was a blind spot, a colossal mute expanse of gray on every map possessed by the American government. What I am about to tell you tonight on Hope Tales is no cheap ghost story meant to elicit a jump scare. It is the desperate, fragmentary, remains salvaged from the tattered notebook of a topographical surveyor employed by the railroad company. A man who brought with him science, iron surveyor's chains, altimeters, and the hubris of a civilization stretching out to devour a continent. He stepped into a nameless forest, only to slowly, tremblingly discover that this land had already been claimed, and those who claimed it, they never age. The autumn of 1881 knocked on the door of northwestern Arkansas, not with crisp, refreshing breezes, but with a dismal decay. By late October, the foliage had surrendered to a tarnished, dull copper and shed almost completely. The skeletal, pallid strips of forest stood huddled together, bearing the grotesque, bashful demeanor of an old man caught bare-chested in the biting frost. The limestone ridges contorted, overlapping one another like muscles cramping from the cold, concealing beneath them hundreds of sinkholes and caverns that remained pitch black even at high noon. Obadiah Kestrel was a man forged to confront such landscape. 44 years of age, he possessed a tall, gaunt, yet wiry frame, the physiology of a child raised in the throes of abject starvation, subsequently remolded by decades of grueling labor. Obadiah was a topographical surveyor hired out of Fort Smith. His mandate was to walk the western fringes of Washington County, parceling out the land for a railroad syndicate that was fiercely impatient to cleave the mountains, slash through the timber, and hurl iron ties and smoke-belching leviathans straight through the lower Ozarks. He was not a man of vibrant imagination. Everything in existence to him could be distilled into quantifiable numbers. The gradient of a hillside, the prevailing direction of the wind, the exact length of a surveyor's chain. His hands were calloused, thickened by overlapping webs of faded scars from years of hauling heavy iron links, to the extent that his wife back home would often joke that he could casually lift a boiling cast iron skillet from the hearth with his bare palms without his facial muscles so much as twitching. Obadiah wore a Colt revolver on his hip, for this territory demanded a baseline of self-preservation, and he perpetually kept a small, hard-bound notebook in his breast pocket, for that was the ledger where he recorded the existence of the world. Any entity, if not etched into that notebook by Obadiah's meticulously even handwriting, simply did not exist. Accompanying him was Caspian Vellum, a 26-year-old youth from the bustling clamor of St. Louis. Caspian sought steady employment to send wages back to his younger sister, and the surveying trade seemed a fair enough prospect. He was short of stature, broad-shouldered, with hair as black as pitch. Caspian harbored a peculiar habit. He would softly whistle nonsensical melodies through his teeth whenever he felt anxious. Yet, what was truly worth noting was that when he was frightened to the absolute core, when the terror breached the threshold of his nervous system's endurance, that whistling would suffer a premature death. In those moments, Caspian fell silent, a viscous, impenetrable silence like that of a grave. On the 23rd of October, they departed from a small settlement named Fayetteville. They brought along a pack mule, rations sufficient for 2 weeks, a canvas field tent, and a lengthy itinerary of coordinates that the railroad company demanded verified before bleeding capital into their machinery. The air that morning was clotted with fog and the acrid stench of horse manure. While waiting for Caspian to strap down the luggage, Obadiah conversed with the stable master, an old man plagued by an aching hip who seemingly harbored a preconceived notion about every square inch of earth in the western half of the state. Obadiah, maintaining the rigid posture of a man of science, casually inquired with the old man about the trails leading into the lower Ozarks. According to what Obadiah later meticulously inscribed in his notebook, the old man abruptly ceased tightening the horse's girth strap. His wrinkled, mud-caked hands halted in mid-air. He slowly looked up, his clouded eyes boring into the towering surveyor. "There are parts of that country," the old man croaked, his voice sliding through his throat like the scraping of coarse sandpaper, "that are nowhere to be found on any of your maps." Obadiah, possessing unwavering faith in his optical instruments and government ledgers, shrugged and replied that he was well aware, and that was precisely why he was being paid to go there. But the old man did not smile. He took a half-step forward, exhaling breath reeking of cheap tobacco into the void between them. "I ain't talking about the rocks or the gullies. I'm talking about the people." Obadiah remained silent. That evening, beneath the flickering glow of a kerosene lantern at the edge of the woods, he opened his notebook and recorded the words with pristine clarity. "This morning, the stable hand told me that there are people not on the map residing in this country." He said nothing more. Merely looked me dead in the eye for a very long time. Obadiah's handwriting pressed slightly harder on the word more. Was it an unconscious curiosity or a macabre premonition newly kindled within his pragmatic brain? No one knows. By the second day, they made camp at the edge of a clearing, roughly 9 miles east of a settlement called Winslow. That night, the wilderness began to unmask its aberrations. Obadiah sat by the meager fire, noting the wind direction and the temperature. Then, in a smaller, heavier script, the script he utilized when logic failed to rationalize the phenomena before his eyes, he wrote, "The dogs do not bark. They had brought no dogs with them." He meant the feral hounds, or the hunting dogs of some mountain man, whose barking he could hear echoing faintly from the unfathomable depths of the rocky hollows. The barking was initially frantic, sharp, but then abruptly, it died. It was not the fading sound of animals running away in the distance. It was the sound of something being violently muzzled, or of creatures suddenly realizing that to make a sound in this moment was synonymous with death. He could distinctly hear the scrabbling of canine claws against stone, the sound of them moving frantically in the dark, but absolutely none dared to utter another whimper. Caspian heard it too. The next morning, the young man, with dark, hollow circles under his eyes, confessed that he had lain awake all night, listening to that horrifying muteness. But Obadiah had heard more than just the dogs. Further away, deep within the dark, suffocating belly of the thick-set ravines, he heard another sound. A sound that did not belong to a wild beast. It sounded akin to the humming of a woman. Yet the pitch was far lower, more guttural than any female vocal cords could produce, and the tempo was sickeningly sluggish. There was a prolonged, agonizing pause of several minutes between each note, as if the thing singing had to rummage through its putrefying memories to recall how humanity strung melodies together. Obadiah carefully transcribed Caspian's account. He recorded the singing. Then, at the bottom of the page, he drew a perfectly straight line and wrote a resolute sentence that would seal the fate of them both. "We continue our work." The arrogance of numbers had triumphed. On the third day, October 25th, they officially trespassed into the core of the den. The topography here defied every geometric theorem. It was serpentine, contorted. You could be walking on a seemingly flat incline, and suddenly the ground to your right would shear off into an abyss so bottomless you had to snatch at a sapling to keep gravity from dragging you into the pitch-black void. Cave mouths gaped from the limestone cliffs at angles that violated the laws of optics. Some were narrow enough to barely admit a human shoulder, while others were so cavernous they could swallow a 4-horse carriage whole. The locals, if they ever strayed here by mistake, knew to lower their heads and steer clear of those stone maws. But surveyors did not. They came to measure. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the light had degenerated into a sickly, sallow amber. Obadiah found a path. He stooped down, extracting his notebook. The acumen of a man who had spent over a decade tramping through the brush told him this was no game trail, for game trails meander and weave to avoid detection. This path was straight. Nor was it the remnant of an old logging road, for there were no wagon ruts, no wheel tracks, and no sawed-off stumps flanking it. The path was approximately 3 feet wide, the dirt packed down hard and as smooth as glass. The layer of decomposing leaves on either side remained perfectly intact, yet not a single fallen leaf rested on the pathway itself. Someone, or something, traversed this route so frequently that the wind never had the chance to fill it with debris. Obadiah did exactly what a government-salaried surveyor is obligated to do. He followed it. Caspian, leading the clattering mule, trailed behind. They waded deep into a sector of the forest that did not exist on any map printed in the capital. The further they went, the more viscous the atmosphere became. The first detail that strangled Obadiah's mind was the sheer antiquity of the timber. The wood here had never tasted the bite of an axe. The oak and hickory trunks were so gargantuan that 2 men joining hands could not encircle them. The canopy above interlaced so densely that the sunlight spilling onto the earth looked murky, diluted, stale, cup of tea forgotten since yesterday. The second detail: there were no birds. Not a single flutter of wings, not a solitary, melodious chirp. The forest was deafeningly silent. Obadiah noted this in his book not once, but twice. The second instance relegated to the margin, underscored by a heavy dark line. The method of a man instructing himself that this phenomenon was entirely too absurd against the laws of nature. But the third detail was the one that made the hairs on the back of Caspian's neck stand on end and brought Obadiah's footsteps to a grinding halt. It was the smell. Had they caught the putrid stench of a rotting boar carcass or the pungent musky odor of skunk spray smeared around a den, their rationality would have immediately accepted it. Those were the laws of the wild. But no, lurking within that stale, tea-colored light, weaving through the thick, mute air, was a sweet aroma. The scent of ripe apples, carefully peeled and stewed, pulp in a cast-iron pot alongside crackling pine wood. It was a warm, secure fragrance, the kind that typically billows from the kitchen of a farmhouse on a bitter autumn afternoon. Yet around them, within a 10-mile radius, there was absolutely no farmhouse. No cornfields, no chimney smoke, no man-made structures whatsoever. Obadiah stopped walking. Caspian, eyes dilated in panic, froze behind him. The 2 men stood paralyzed on the packed dirt path, engulfed by the twilight beneath the ancient trees, forced to fill their lungs with the smell of stewed apples emanating from an invisible kitchen. In his notebook, Obadiah recorded that moment with absolute precision. We stood there for approximately a quarter of an hour by my watch, neither man speaking a word. 15 minutes. Let your mind sink into that span of time. 15 agonizingly long minutes, standing stock still in the deep woods, listening to the blood pounding against your eardrums, encircled by an unseen snare that was slowly strangling reality. Not a single whistle escaped Caspian's lips. He was so terrified that he had even ceased to tremble. Finally, Obadiah, his Adam's apple bobbing slightly, issued an order in a hoarse, thick voice. "We will return to camp on the ridge. We will come back here tomorrow morning." Caspian replied with only 2 words, his tone as paper-thin as a ghost. "Yes, sir." They turned their backs. They did not run, for predatory instinct teaches all creatures that the moment you run, whatever is hiding in the dark will pursue. They walked briskly back up the path. And this is when the forest began to masticate the rationality of the man who measured. Obadiah was a surveyor. Counting paces was no longer a conscious effort. It was as natural as breathing. On the way down from the first point, his boot heel touched the trail to the spot where they halted to smell the apples. His brain had silently tallied 1,412 paces. They were walking back up that exact same path. No diverging branches, no detours. The packed dirt surface had not altered in the slightest the 1,412th pace passed. They were still amidst the colossal trunks, the stale tea-colored light still draping over them. There was no sign of the starting point, the 1,800th pace. Cold sweat poured out, soaking Obadiah's woolen undershirt. The iron chain slung over his shoulder suddenly felt as heavy as a block of lead. The 2,500th pace. Caspian, trailing behind, began to hyperventilate. The young man could bear it no longer. His voice, fractured and brittle, echoed from behind Obadiah's neck. Are we close to the top yet, sir?" Obadiah, a man who adhered to the transparency of numbers his entire life, a man who had never falsified a single measurement, swallowed hard and answered, "Soon, the 2,900th pace." On the 2,900th step, the path finally spat them out. They were violently expelled from the darkened sector, returning to the familiar crest of the hillside, just as the pitch-black night swallowed the landscape. The distance out was double the distance in. The forest was not merely vast, it breathed, and it had just gently loosened its web, warped reality, and stretched space to inform these two frail creatures of flesh and bone. Your science means absolutely nothing here. That night, they pitched a freezing camp on the ridge. Neither dared to light a fire. Obadiah refused to let the brilliant blaze act as a beacon, broadcasting their position to whatever was cooking supper with the scent of stewed apples down in the hollow. By the light of a minuscule candle stub carefully shielded within the folds of his coat, Caspian sat trembling, penning a letter to his sister. That letter was later found, folded small and tucked into his breast pocket. It was the only piece of paper Caspian ever wrote that survived in this world. He wrote in the frantic, jagged scrawl of a man whose mind was being eroded by the muteness of the night. I do not think we should go down there tomorrow. But I do not think I have any way of telling him that. Beside him, Obadiah Kestrel lay wide awake. His calloused hands gripped the notebook in a death vice. Inside his mind, the numbers 1,412 and 2,900 collided violently, obliterating every natural order he had placed his faith in for 44 years of life. And the most terrifying part was, he knew he was going to go back. The hubris of a man carrying the mantle of enlightenment had dug his own grave. And that grave leisurely opened its maw to welcome them, with the very first pallid ray of dawn on the 26th of October. The air that morning was razor-sharp, slicing into their flesh with a dry, bitter cold, yet inside Obadiah Kestrel's chest there congealed an indescribable suffocation. This time, he would not allow the forest to make a mockery of him. The intellect of a man of science demanded physical proof. Every 50 paces downward, Obadiah stopped, retrieved a stick of white chalk, and scored a heavy, stark line against the rough bark of the nearest tree. The sound of the chalk grinding against the wood was a dry, rasping scrape, crumbling into white dust that rained down upon the rotting leaves. Caspian walked directly behind him, both hands strangling the stock of his rifle until his knuckles turned bone-white, his eyes darting ceaselessly among the dark recesses between the gargantuan trunks. The 500th pace. The 1,000th pace. Both men were drenched in sweat. A frigid perspiration seeped beneath layers of wool, pasting their garments to their flesh, inducing a clammy, creeping chill down their spines. The forest remained deaf and dumb. The only sounds were the thud of leather boot heels striking the concrete-hard dirt and the heavy, ragged exhalations of Caspian. Then that scent returned. Sweet, steaming, the aroma of stewed apples snaked through the gaps in the foliage, boring into their nasal cavities, breathing a cloying, sickly sweetness into the backs of their throats. Yesterday it had been a mere anomaly. Today that odor became oppressive, invasive, a harbinger of a living entity. The 1,400th pace. Obadiah tightened his grip on the surveyor's chain. The 1,412th pace. They halted. Obadiah turned his head to look back. The white chalk marks still lay brazenly exposed on the tree trunks, forming a faint string of dots that trailed back up the slope. The measured figure was flawlessly accurate. 1,412 paces, not an inch of deviation. Whatever invisible force had spaced the previous evening, warping the trail into 900 paces of sheer despair, had this morning spared them. It did not stretch the path. This revelation ought to have granted a profound loss to the two surveyors, but it did not. Because the reason the path did not lengthen was that it had decided to open up. Barely 300 paces beyond the point where they had surrendered yesterday, the ancient trunks abruptly retreated, yielding to a clearing. The light here was no longer choked by the canopy, yet it maintained a murky, clouded hue, as though the sky above this enclave had been soiled centuries ago. Obadiah withdrew his notebook. In a handwriting that was terrifyingly flat, he documented: settlement, 6 structures, no chimney smoke, no visible livestock, no sound, population unknown. That is what he wrote. But what actually materialized before their eyes was a blasphemy against every law of time and cartography. It was a village that the entire state of Arkansas remained blissfully ignorant of, that the federal government had overlooked, and that the residents of Winslow, 9 miles away, had never breathed a word about. 6 log cabins were arranged in a lopsided horseshoe surrounding a flat hut-packed dirt yard. Those cabins exuded an antiquity that induced nausea. There was no palm thatch, no layer of paint. The logs erecting the structures had bleached into a cadaverous gray, the merciless gray that natural wood can only don after being battered by the elements for a solid century. The mud chinking between the timber gaps had cracked and been repatched with newer layers, but newer here still resided decades in the past. The roofs were shingled with rough-hewn wooden slabs, a method of roofing Obadiah had only ever witnessed via faint sketches in historical texts chronicling the earliest pioneers, those who had traversed the Cumberland Gap, before this territory had even been christened. Dead center in the dirt yard sat a well constructed of stone. The rough stones encircling its mouth had been worn perfectly smooth. They were polished, slick, reflecting even the anemic light of the day. How many tens of thousands of hands had to brace against it, chafing over it across decades, to turn solid rock into a surface so glassy? In the dusty earth surrounding the well, there were footprints, a multitude of footprints, fresh ones. There was absolute silence. No sound of children weeping, no sound of women weaving, no sound of shovels scraping coal, not a single wisp of smoke ascending from the stone chimneys. Yet the most blood-curdling detail was the dogs. No hound charged out, barking and baring its fangs. Even so, when Obadiah focused the entirety of his consciousness on his ears, he heard them. Beneath the creaking floorboards, in the shadowed alcoves around the yard, there was the sound of Dot breathing, the soft, wheezing, rattling exhalations of chests rising and falling. The dogs were there, fully awake, tracking every movement of the intruders, but some unseen dominion had crushed their animalistic instincts, clamped down on their throats, and forbidden them from uttering so much as the faintest whimper. Obadiah and Caspian stood rooted at the timberline for a very long time. Both could feel the primal warning sirens screaming through their veins, "Turn back, do not take another step." Every tale of those who vanish into eternity shares this common boundary. They knew what lay in wait, yet they stepped forward anyway, and Obadiah stepped forward. He cleared his throat, the sound fracturing the suffocating silence. He utilized the exact traditional, polite, and distinct greeting that any man of the 19th century would employ when trespassing on a stranger's land to avoid getting his skull blown open. "Hello, the house." There was no reply. He raised his voice and called out a second time. This time, from inside the largest log cabin, situated at the nadir of the horseshoe, the one hemorrhaging that overpowering scent of stewed apples, something moved. In his notebook, Obadiah recorded, "Sound as of a chair being pushed back from a table." And then in the margin he amended in a minuscule trembling script, "Many chairs." The heavy wooden door slowly groaned open, dragging across the floorboards with a dry, grating shriek. A man stepped out into the dim light. He was old, ancient. Obadiah calculated him to be at least 70, if not vastly older. The figure was gaunt, withered to the point of resembling a skeletal frame cobbled together from dry twigs and sheathed in skin as pallid as parchment. He was dressed in clean garments, but the cut, the style of them, good God, they belonged to an era before America had even waged war with Mexico. It had been 30 or 40 years since that style of long-tailed waistcoat had graced any street. His beard was silver gray, hanging in long, curling tendrils well past his sternum. But the thing that caused Obadiah's breath to seize in his throat was the eyes. The old man's eyes were a pale gray, so diluted they were almost a clouded, milky white, hazy as if veiled by cataracts. Those eyes did not move, they did not dart back and forth to observe in the manner of men. They locked onto Obadiah's face, settling there, static and lifeless, precisely like the eyes of a blind owl perched on a dead branch that has already predetermined the fate of its prey. "You gentlemen are a long way off your road," the old man's voice drifted out. It was soft, pleasant, so soothing that it was obscenely incongruous with his dilapidated shell. Obadiah swallowed dryly, striving to maintain the cadence of a civil servant. He introduced himself, explaining slowly and methodically that he was a surveyor for the railroad company, and that he was merely executing his duties of measurement with absolutely no intention of encroaching upon private property. The old man simply stood there, drowning in his archaic garments, listening without blinking a single time. When Obadiah finished, the old man's lips curled into a faint smirk. "There is no road that runs through here, so you cannot be lost from it. You are simply here." He smiled. That smile did not so much as shift the wrinkles encasing those dead white eyes. Obadiah saw the teeth behind that smile. They were yellowed, yet immaculately even, devoid of a single missing tooth, as though the entire jaw had been cast simultaneously and subjected to the exact same degree of abrasion. He introduced himself as Ambrose Threll. He claimed that the settlement had been here a long while. He utilized that exact phrase, adamantly refusing to supply a specific chronology of years. He stated that his people kept to themselves, never venturing out to Winslow to trade, because that town was too loud. And when Obadiah, driven by the ingrained nature of a man who demands exactitude, asked how many souls resided here, Ambrose replied, "By my count, 14 of us, give or take." "How many of those are grown?" "All of them," Ambrose answered curtly. The way he delivered the word was akin to a cellar door slamming shut, barring all further curiosity. But Obadiah asked anyway, his voice as thin as smoke. "No young ones at all, sir." Ambrose Threll stared into Obadiah's eyes for a profound stretch of time, so long that the rustling of the wind through the canopy sounded like a sledgehammer. Then he spoke, slowly, "Not for a long time, we do not have those here anymore." He did not elaborate on what those meant. Instead, he invited them inside for a meal. Directly behind Obadiah, young Caspian emitted a strangled sound deep within his throat. It was the fractured noise of a beast caught in an iron trap, desperate to scream its refusal, yet its brain was so paralyzed it could not locate the vocabulary to avoid offending the hunter. But Obadiah, partially due to his hollow stomach, and partially due to a morbid scientific curiosity that eclipsed the terrified human fragment of his soul, nodded. He said yes. They stepped over the rotting wooden threshold. Inside the cramped, shadowy cabin that reeked faintly of mildew, 11 people sat in waiting. Counting Ambrose, that made 12. A number less than the 14 the old man had just declared. Yet no one in the room made any attempt to explain the discrepancy, and Obadiah knew his place well enough to clamp his mouth shut. Every one of them was old. Every visage in the room was a topography of overlapping wrinkles, resembling shards of cracked, desiccated leather. In his ledger, Obadiah recorded that horrifying tableau. "I could not place an age on any of them under 60. The majority must be over 70. There are 3 I would wager are past 80. The youngest-looking individual in the room was a skeletal woman. She appeared to be roughly Obadiah's age, around 44, but her eyes, dear God, they bore the exact same clouded, milky white pallor as Ambrose's. She did not speak a word. She soundlessly placed 2 crudely hand-carved wooden bowls before the guests, then retreated, taking a seat on a stool at the far, shadowy end of the long table. She folded her hands in her lap, and she began to stare fixedly at Obadiah as he chewed. Throughout the entirety of that meal she did not blink a single time. In the bowl lay apples stewed to a mush, exuding a cloying, sickly sweet odor that clung aggressively to the throat, accompanied by a coarse dark bread that possessed a pungent, sweetish tang Obadiah could not possibly identify. The surveyor's observational instincts began to claw at his sanity. The absurdity of it all struck with greater force than the fear of the dark. There was no meat. He noted this twice in his ledger. They were deep within the Ozark wilderness in late October, a season when deer, wild turkey, and feral hogs roamed freely through every hollow within a day's walk. Yet on the dining table of these 11 individuals, there was not a single scrap of meat, and vastly more terrifying than the meat, a truth that slammed into Obadiah's chest like a physical blow. There was no salt. In the margin of the page, he had inscribed the word salt, followed by an enormous question mark. The absence of salt in an ancient settlement in the 19th century, isolated in the deep wilderness, was a flagrant violation of the laws of survival. Salt was the anchor of human existence. It was used to cure pork, preserve hides, sprinkle into dough, and to repel rats from the cornmeal barrels. Salt was the singular method by which mankind survived a flesh-freezing winter. In his lifetime, Obadiah had crossed the thresholds of countless dilapidated nomad shacks. They might lack flour, sugar, coffee, tea, whiskey, or tobacco, but never had there been a cabin, a locus of human existence, that was devoid of salt. Here, salt did not exist. The bread bore no trace of salinity. The stewed apples were bland. The 11 ancient figures chewed and swallowed this tasteless sustenance as impassively as automatons. Obadiah's mind reeled. Why did they not require salt? The answer slowly took shape in his brain, bearing a bone-chilling horror. Because they did not need to preserve anything. The ashen bodies seated around this table. They were not bound by putrefaction. They were not eroded by time, and they no longer operated according to any biological laws of ordinary humanity. Obadiah cast a glance at the wooden cups on the table. The 11 of them were drinking water. He scrutinized the shimmering liquid, and later described it as the clearest, most pristine water he had ever seen drawn from a stone well. It was unnaturally transparent, as though it had been filtered through something. Filtered through what? He never dared to write down. The conversation at the dining table carried a macabre, malformed resonance. Ambrose was the sole figure to open his mouth. He inquired about the railroad line, he asked of Fort Smith, and he inquired about the president. When Obadiah informed him that the current president was Chester Arthur, having taken office merely weeks prior following the assassination of Garfield, the ancient man with the milky white eyes nodded with a creeping slowness. He acted as though he were retrieving a dossier buried deep within his rot-riddled brain before finally lifting his voice. Arthur, that is a fine name. We had an Arthur once back then. He did not specify which century back then belonged to. By mid-afternoon, hovering around 3 o'clock, Ambrose stood up, the legs of his chair scraping a dry shriek against the wooden floorboards. You gentlemen will likely want to be getting back to your camp before full dark. It was an exquisitely polite sentence, yet it bore the crushing weight of a death warrant. Obadiah, a weather-beaten man forged by the elements, had never, in his 4 years of existence, yearned to flee with such violent desperation. He scrambled to his feet, letting 2 words drop from his lips. Yes, sir, assuredly. Ambrose escorted them to the edge of the packed dirt yard. He paused beside the rim of the well. His withered, desiccated hands, mottled with age spots, rested upon the stones that had been polished to a glass-like smoothness. Those clouded, white eyes locked dead onto Obadiah's pupils, and the old man whispered, his voice as thin as a passing breeze, I would count it a kindness, sir, if you do not mention us when you return. We have been here a very long time without being mentioned, and we should like to keep it that way. Obadiah nodded his promise. Within his notebook he recorded that vow. Yet directly in the adjacent margin he etched a definitive decree. I have absolutely no intention of keeping my word. The hubris of a government official screamed within him that he was obligated to report the existence of this phantom nest. They turned their backs and hurried up the path. This time, Caspian was the one counting, 1,012 paces. Not a single off the path had spat them out, behaving with an artificial mocking docility. They dragged their feet up to the ridge, pitched their camp, and tremblingly coaxed a fire to life. They believed they had escaped. But they did not know that the darkness of the forest was slowly coagulating, and that when the sun was entirely entombed beneath the Ozark ridges, the true transaction of the day would officially commence. The field fire on the hillside popped and crackled, spitting glowing red embers that spiraled upward before dying out, absorbed into the viscous black canopy, marking the exact hour when every law of the daylight was formally stripped away. The darkness in the Ozark Ranges is unlike the darkness of cities or open plains. Here the dark possesses physical weight. It presses down upon the chest, slithers through the tiers of pine needles, crawls across the frigid earth, and burrows into every pore of the skin. The temperature plummeted drastically. The dry, biting chill of the day now mutated into a damp, bone-piercing cold that covertly gnawed at their flesh. Obadiah Kestrel was submerged in sleep, or at least an exhausted catatonic state akin to sleep that a man might achieve after his entire belief system had just been violently fractured. He lay with his back to the fire, his breathing ragged and labored. Caspian assumed the second watch. The 26-year-old youth sat huddled, his back pressed against the rough, abrasive bark of an ancient oak. His rifle lay horizontally across his thighs. The metallic surface of the barrel was ice-cold, pressed against bare hands that ceaselessly secreted sweat. Adhering to Obadiah's orders, Caspian had not fed the fire with new wood. The blaze was now nothing more than a bed of furious red coals, feebly radiating a narrow, jagged ring of light, enough to warm a pair of boots, but absolutely insufficient to illuminate whatever might be lurking a mere 10 paces away. The air was suffocatingly thick, with the acrid stench of charcoal smoke mingled with the damp, earthy reek of mud and mildew. Everything was mute. A silence so profound that Caspian could hear the frantic thudding of his own blood against his eardrums, and then that silence was violently lacerated by a surreal vibration. From down in the pitch-black hollow, something was ascending. Initially, Caspian pressed his lips tight, desperately attempting to convince his knotting stomach that it was merely a deer. At this hour, wild deer frequently migrated from the empty ravines to the higher ridges to bed down. This creature was also moving upward. Yet, as the rustling friction against the earth grew more distinct, Caspian's rationality was backed into a corner. Deer do not walk on two legs. Nor do deer ever move with such a sickeningly steady rhythmic cadence. The thing approaching was no stray animal. It was walking with absolute precision upon the very packed dirt path they had surveyed that day. Caspian stared, wide-eyed, at the boundary between the glowing coals and the abyss. His breath stagnated in his lungs. Not a single whistle escaped his lips. The sheer, unadulterated terror had padlocked his vocal cords. A silhouette slowly emerged from the void. The entity stopped exactly at the periphery of the ember's light. It did not take another step, merely standing as still as a statue sculpted from a corpse. Through the fragmented, trembling notes that Caspian later surrendered to the sheriff in Fayetteville, we are able to envision the morphology of the entity that night. The ashen, heavily wrinkled skin caught the blood-red glow of coals, highlighting a long, spiraling beard that cascaded down past its chest, but the most horrifying feature was the eyes. Pale gray, sluggish, clouded eyes, yet, when the faint light struck them, they flared with the chilling, reflective luminescence of a nocturnal predator. Similar to the eyes of a bobcat or an opossum caught in a beam, but infinitely more malignant, for no human eyes on this earth, regardless of pigmentation, should possess the capacity to glow in the dark like that. It was one of the old men from the village below, Caspian's hands paralyzed against the rifle stock. His index finger lay flush against the trigger guard. The reasoning of a 19th-century man screamed at him to raise the barrel, to squeeze the trigger, to utilize firepower, to rip apart this blasphemy of creation standing before him. But a primordial instinct, something vastly older than human civilization, uncoiled from the deepest recesses of Caspian's reptilian brain, forcing him to freeze. He realized with crystalline, despairing clarity that the very fraction of an inch he moved that muzzle, the old man would also move. And whatever the old man decided to do next would undoubtedly be thousands of times more atrocious than what he was currently doing, which was nothing, so Caspian did not flinch. He inhaled through his nose, the freezing air slicing painfully into his lungs. He stared directly into those glowing, milky white eyes, and he strained his ears to listen. The old man was breathing. Due to the suffocating proximity, Caspian could distinctly hear the expansion of the creature's alveoli. It was not the rapid, hyperventilating breath of someone concealing fear. Nor was it the ragged, frenzied panting of a wild beast aroused by prey. It was slow, methodical, rhythmically cruel. In the letter he left behind, Caspian described that respiration with a comparison that would chill the spine of anyone who read it. It was the breathing of a carpenter, calmly measuring a piece of wood before taking the saw to it. The old man did not view Caspian as a threat, nor did he view him as an enemy requiring eradication. He was merely taking a measurement. And then, the thing the old man was cradling against his chest writhed. At first, Caspian had assumed it was a bundle of firewood, or perhaps some wounded feral animal the old man was carrying, in the manner a woman holds an infant to her breast. But when the thing moved, it produced a squelching, visceral rustle, the unmistakable friction of flesh, not of fur or bark. I must tread carefully when recounting this portion, for Caspian himself adamantly refused to confront it. In his notebook he penned only a single sentence regarding the object nestled within those skeletal arms. It was not what I had initially thought it to be. I have resolved that I shall never write down what I thought it was. I will only say that when it stirred, the old one adjusted his grip upon it and gently stroked the crown of it with his thumb, in the exact manner you would soothe a fragile living thing you did not wish to wake. That solitary detail alone is enough to drag down the psychological defenses of the reader. What was the nature of that sickeningly tender, diseased affection directed at an entity concealed in the dark? Was it a deformed portion of a corpse, a gelatinous remnant of the unfortunate surveyors who came before, or something utterly alien to the biological constraints of humanity? Caspian's brain was forced to defend itself by entirely expunging that image from his conscious memory, refusing to crucify it upon the page. How long the two entities, one representing panicked humanity, the other embodying putrefying stillness, maintained that locked stare, Caspian did not know. It could have been 10 minutes, it could have been a century. Finally, the old man slowly pivoted on his heel. His gaunt silhouette was swallowed by the viscous blackness of the trail, taking with it the rustling sounds and the slow, measuring breaths as he departed. Caspian did not wake Obadiah. He knew waking him would be utterly futile. He remained sitting there, petrified into stone, his bloodshot eyes stretched wide and glued to the darkness, both hands strangling the rifle, until the final embers died out into a blanket of gray ash, and the sickly, pallid light of dawn began to tear the firmament. The next morning, the moment Obadiah jolted awake, the very first thing Caspian did was recount the entire ordeal. His voice was fractured, trembling, and as fragile as spider silk. Obadiah did not interrupt him. The morning air was drenched in dew, bitterly cold, yet sweat was pouring down the surveyor's forehead. He dragged his notebook out. The hand that had once held a leveling instrument with millimeter precision was now fumbling, shaking violently. At the bottom of the previous day's page he bore down hard on the pencil, inscribing a definitive decree that shattered the entire mission. Survey suspended. We shall depart for Fayetteville this very morning. I will report directly to the marshal. They frantically broke camp. Fingers stiffened by the frost and sheer terror hurriedly collapsed the canvas tent. They led the pack mule, keeping their heads down, retreating back up over the two ridges, aiming straight for the emergency cache of supplies they had meticulously buried 4 days prior. A trek that ought to have taken a mere 2 hours on foot stretched into a grueling 3-hour agony as the topography seemed to warp, thorny thickets clawed at them, and absolute panic eroded their stamina. Around 10 in the morning, when the sunlight had begun to burn off the fog, they arrived. But the clearing was empty. The entirety of their reserve supplies had vanished. There were no signs of a chaotic excavation. No scattered debris, no bite marks or tearings from bears or feral hogs. The patch of earth where they had concealed their goods was perfectly smooth. The heavy canvas tarp they had used to cover the cargo was still there, but it had not been tossed aside. It was folded with an excruciating, methodical precision, square, unwrinkled, exactly the way a meticulous housewife folds bed linens on a Sunday. The tarp was placed squarely in the exact center of the cleared earth. Obadiah stopped dead in his tracks, his breath suffocating in his chest. He stared blankly at the canvas. It radiated a nauseating tidiness, an ultimate mockery. He stepped closer, dropping one knee to the freezing dirt, his calloused hand trembling as he lifted the edge of the tarp. Beneath the canvas, resting silently upon the damp earth, lay an object. It was a dried apple, The apple had been placed statically, aligned with absolute geometric precision at the epicenter of the clearing. Its shriveled, darkened surface exuded that same cloying, acrid sweet scent of the kitchen from the day before. The oxygen around them seemed to be violently extracted. The sheer absurdity of it dealt a fatal blow to Obadiah's psyche. They had never brought apples on this expedition. Their rations consisted strictly of hardtack, salt pork, coffee, beans, and a meager amount of dried beef. There was absolutely no source of apples within their inventory, and within a radius of many miles there was certainly not a single wild apple tree to be found. This dried apple was the exact same variety of apple that those 11 living corpses had chewed in absolute silence down in the village. Obadiah dared not touch it. Gooseflesh erupted in blisters across his arms. He recoiled his hand, letting the canvas drop, concealing the apple exactly as it had been. He carefully located a heavy stone to weigh it down, then opened his ledger and recorded with a robotic detachment. I have done this to mark the spot for any search party that may follow. Yet, the truth he omitted from the page regarding that apple was the very thing screaming the loudest within his skull at that moment. The distance from last night's camp to this cache was a 3-hour hike. That meant while that blind old man stood staring at Caspian by the firelight, the others, the ones without names, had silently slithered through the blinding snow of the night, traversed 2 pathless ridges, pinpointed the exact location of the cache to the inch, and hauled away all that heavy cargo without snapping a single twig. They had not followed them, they had gone ahead of them. They knew exactly what they were going to do, and exactly where they were going. The wind shrieked in fits through the barren treetops. In his notebook, Obadiah hastily recorded the current temperature. Sweat dripped onto the yellowing paper. In the margin, he pressed the lead down hard, etching the final, concluding realization of his collapsing logical framework. They are not wild beasts. They know where we are going. And the message conveyed by the apple, placed neatly beneath that perfectly folded canvas, was abundantly clear, as cold and sharp as a blade pressed against their throats. We can take your lives whenever we please, even while you are awake. But for now, we are merely taking the food. The silent threat, radiating from that dried apple, clung to them like a viscous film of scales that could not be scraped off, cornering their brains into a state of mute hysteria. They fled. The flight did not manifest in screaming or the frantic, stampeding thunder of boots. Rather, it assumed the shape of a bone-deep exhaustion, dilapidated and reeking of despair. Obadiah Kestrel wrung every last drop stamina from both men and the aging mule, pushing their retreat to a brutalizing limit. There was no time to pause for a midday meal. No time to breathe. The air whistling through their teeth was bone-dry, carrying the metallic, coppery taste of blood seeping from lungs pushed beyond their physiological capacity. Beneath the dense, ancient canopy, the shadows seemed to elongate into spindly, gelatinous fingers reaching out to graze their boot heels. The sensation of dozens of milky white eyes boring into the napes of their necks lacerated every nerve ending. It was not until the suffocating draughts of the hollow were left behind, surrendering to the razor-sharp, freezing winds of the exposed ridges, that they dared to believe they had temporarily slipped from the forest's gullet. The sunset of October 27th smeared a bruised, fractured streak of blood across the horizon, casting a lurid red glow over the sparse timberline at the edge of Winslow. There, on the leaf-choked trail, a man sat waiting. He sat motionless upon a half-sawn stump. It was Hosea Trent, the farmer Obadiah had casually conversed with 4 days prior before descending into the sinkhole. Hosea was around 50, with a broad barrel chest, a salt-and-pepper beard, and a left hand missing a finger. The long-barreled rifle resting across his thighs caught the freezing light of the dusk. When he saw the 2 ragged silhouettes, dragging the mule behind them, stumble out from the dark archway of the trees, Hosea slowly stood up. He displayed no relief. His eyes, deeply etched with crow's feet, swept over Obadiah and Caspian as if desperately trying to ascertain whether they were living men or merely hollow husks spat back out by the forest to deceive the town. "You came back out," Hosea rasped. The sound was thick, gravelly, carrying an abyss of utter astonishment, as if, up until this very second, the man had been entirely convinced he was waiting for ghosts. Obadiah nodded, his parched throat managing to expel only a single syllable. Yes. Hosea stood rooted to the earth, his thumb working nervously over the rifle's stock. Wind rustled through the pines. He narrowed his eyes, grinding out every word, dropping his volume to a level only the three of them could hear. How many of them did you count in there? Obadiah, clinging with blind loyalty to his numbers even as his sanity teetered on the precipice, swallowed hard and answered, 12 at the table, 14, according to the old man's count. Hosea Trant's sun-baked face turned to stone. The muscle in his cheek twitched violently. He slowly squeezed his eyes shut, inhaling a deep, shuddering breath as if to suppress a violent tremor slithering up his spine. 12 at the meal, he muttered, chewing on the number again and again. Impossible. The last time anyone came back out of there, the count was not 12. He opened his eyes, boring a hole straight through Obadiah, his voice fracturing. 3 years ago, a trapper from over in Madison County wandered in there. He crawled his way out. And he counted 9, only 9. 6 weeks later he died of a fever no medicine could touch. His wife threw his journal directly into the hearth with her own hands because she screamed that the things he wrote in his final days were not fit for Christian eyes. Obadiah felt an icy shudder crawl from his tailbone to the crown of his skull. He asked, his voice gossamer thin, "How do you know?" "Because I am the one she gave it to first, to read, to see if I could make sense of that lunatic scribbling before she set it ablaze." Hosea tightened his grip on the gun. "Get down to my house, right now. Do not stop in Winslow under any circumstance. Pull your hat brims down, don't look at anyone, don't speak to a soul. Just look like from surveying some dull hills. They have eyes in this town." Hosea did not elaborate on what eyes meant. He turned and walked away. The implication of a network of accomplices, or the silent gaze of the demonic lurking beneath the facade of mild-mannered neighbors, dropped yet another suffocating shroud of fog over the minds of the two surveyors. The small homestead of the Trant family sat concealed behind a grove of dying, yellowed corn. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of burnt coffee and sour sweat. Tabitha, Hosea's wife, a diminutive woman whose face had once held a delicate beauty, now eroded to the bone by poverty and invisible, gnawing anxiety, silently poured sludge-black coffee into chipped mugs. In a corner swallowed by shadows, Linus, Hosea's younger cousin, sat cross-legged on the floorboards. He offered no greeting, merely focusing obsessively on rubbing oil into the mechanism of a rifle. The sound of coarse cloth scraping against the barrel, the metallic clack of the firing pin snapping dryly into place, echoed in a steady rhythm, harmonizing with the relentless ticking of the grandfather clock on the wall. This safe house was oppressively claustrophobic. It felt exactly like a bunker holding its breath, awaiting a carpet bombing, and in the span of that long, agonizingly drawn-out evening, under the flickering, sickly light of a kerosene lamp that belched acrid smoke, Hosea Trant began to tear open the blood-soaked archives of Winslow. Tales passed down through 3 generations, slick with the secrets that the people of the Ozarks would sooner spit on the ground than utter in the light of day. Hosea's grandfather had settled in this region in the 1820s, long before Arkansas was even recognized as a state. But the things down in Devil's Den had been there prior to that. No one knew where they originated. There was a legend claiming they were the remnants of the first pioneer wagon train to cross the Cumberland Gap. That they had been trapped in a winter so apocalyptic they were forced to consume human flesh to survive, and that such blasphemy had fundamentally altered them, mutating them into a different species. The survivors of the train, once the thaw came, had disgustedly cast them out, driving them south. They drifted into the den, erected 6 log cabins, and then, for all eternity, never built a 7th. But that is only half the truth, the half folks cling to so they can sleep at night. Hosea took a swig of the pitch-black coffee, the bitter sludge sliding down his throat. The dancing firelight warped the wrinkles on his face into deep, cavernous trenches. My grandfather told me there was a second variation, a variation they forbid telling the children. That they didn't come from the Cumberland at all, that they were already there. When the very first white man's wagons rolled through here, they saw those 6 rotting cabins standing there. They didn't look like white men. They didn't carry the features of the Cherokee or the Osage, my grandfather said. They looked like no creature the Lord ever penned into the book of life. Following the current of time, the invisible octopian tentacles of Devil's Den slowly extended, snatching the wretched souls who washed into their territory. The cadence of Hosea's storytelling grew increasingly frantic, punctuated by dry, clicking swallows. The 1850s, a circuit-riding preacher, armed with a leather-bound Bible, and the sheer arrogance of bringing the light of the gospel to savages, rode into the hollow. He never returned, but his horse did. It strolled out of the timberline, its coat brushed to a pristine shine, its hooves immaculately cleaned of mud. And around the horse's neck, tied with absolute mathematical perfection like a ribbon on a Christmas gift, was a strip of leather. The preacher's wife fainted the moment she laid eyes on it. It was the sweatband torn from the interior of the felt hat her husband always wore. Someone in the dark had meticulously removed that strip of leather from the hat of a corpse, smoothed it out flawlessly, and tied it around the animal's neck. That sadistic mockery carried an eternal message. Your faith is useless here. The 1860s, during the eruption of the Civil War. A quintet of Confederate irregulars, armed with rifles and the savagery of war, stormed the den hunting for deserters. Only one man dragged his mutilated, shattered mind back out. He spent the remainder of his life in the county asylum, locked behind rusted iron bars. He never spoke of how his 4 comrades died. He merely clawed the flesh from his own face, screaming into the void of his cell, repeating a horrifying mantra that Hosea remembered verbatim from the clerk's records. They ain't dead. I saw them stand up, and they're walking to find me. They're just walking slow, creeping a mile closer every year, crossing the mountains to find me. The asylum was 40 miles from the den, but in the soldier's fractured mind the darkness was slowly, inevitably, devouring that distance. The 1870s, a logging crew ventured in. The first team evaporated entirely. The second team returned with exactly half its men, and one of them expired on the road home with a hollow medical diagnosis of exhaustion of an unusual character. And in every single decade, Hosea slammed his palm down onto the wooden table with a sharp, dry crack that made Caspian jump out of his skin. The pungent stench of sour sweat billowed from the farmer. Their numbers always went down. My grandfather said in the 30s there were roughly 30 of them. By the time of the preacher, his last notes estimated a score. During the war, the mad soldier babbled about 15 ghosts. 3 years ago, the trapper counted 9. Hosea lunged forward, his feverish breath washing over Obadiah's face. Do you understand, sir? They do not breed, they take in no orphans. No outsider has ever joined them, and no one from this town of Winslow has ever vanished without a trace. They just age, they rot, they shrivel up across the centuries. For decades, there hasn't been a single cry of a child. The silence in the room thickened into something viscous, heavy as a ton of limestone. The ticking of the clock struck the eardrums like a deafening hammer. Linus's gun cleaning had ceased entirely. Hosea widened his panicked eyes, the whites threaded with bloody red veins. So, by whatever hell reigns in the sky above us, why in God's name did you count 14 today? A coldness like a glacier slid directly into Obadiah's stomach. His heart beat erratically, pounding so violently he felt his ribcage might shatter. The cognition of a mathematician, a man who built maps, suddenly threaded all the variables together, assembling a portrait so astronomically atrocious it made him want to vomit. 9 old people 3 years ago, 14 people yesterday afternoon. A discrepancy of 5. Where did 5 new humans materialize from in a sterile, time-forgotten village, absolutely isolated from the realm of mankind? Obadiah's hand dove into his coat, ripping his notebook out with manic velocity. He unsheathed his pencil and drove the lead fiercely into the yellowing paper. He wrote in a spasm of sheer terror, massive beads of sweat cascading down to blur the sharp, angular script. The supplies were taken by beings who knew exactly what we intended to do. He wrote, the sharp lead gouging so deeply it nearly tore the parchment. They bypassed us over 2 ridges in the mute black of night. There were too many footprints. His breathing accelerated, wheezing like a ruptured bellows. There are not 14 of them. Obadiah continued, his logic screaming as it unearthed the truth. There were never 14. The old man Ambrose deliberately uttered that number because he wanted us to repeat it to the outside world. And then the most repulsive equation of all struck him. 5 new people. 5 people who were not born but manufactured. They did not need to procreate because they viewed those who strayed into the hollow not merely as sustenance or playthings. They viewed humans as raw materials, those missing souls, the surveyors, the soldiers, the foolish hunters. They had never truly died. Their identities were shredded, the salt stripped from their flesh, force-fed that rotting, cloying stewed apple, and slowly, meticulously transmuted, dissolved into that gray, ageless collective to replace the ancient husks that had finally crumbled to dust. And just as the pencil lead was on the verge of snapping under his frantic pressure, Obadiah Kestrel slashed the final sentence into the right margin of the book. The final sentence of his life, the sentence that permanently entombed a man's hope of survival. I believe they are vastly more numerous. I believe the entirety of their flock was there, hiding behind the timber, watching us from the very moment we set foot on the path, that God-forsaken village. Those 11 sitting around the table. That was merely the surface they permitted us to see. That veneer of deceit finally swallowed him whole at the crack of dawn the following day. The fog on the 28th of October had not yet dissipated. It drifted, thick and freezing, past the grimy windows of the Trant house when Obadiah Kestrel climbed onto the back of the pack mule alone. He left Caspian behind, tucking the notebook tightly against his chest, and rode straight for Fayetteville to deliver his report to the marshal. The surveyor's eyes were simultaneously shattered and hardened by the lunatic resolve of a man attempting to wield human law and gunpowder against eternity. It was the last time anyone ever saw him drawing breath. Caspian sat huddled in the corner of the Trant kitchen for 3 grueling days, listening to the wind shriek through the warped floorboards, clawing the skin around his fingernails until they bled. Obadiah did not return. On the 4th day, Hosea and Lina elected to ride to Fayetteville themselves. At the town office they were met with a truth that slammed into their chests like an anvil. Obadiah Kestrel had never arrived. The county marshal, Pleasant Crowder, was a man rooted in pragmatism, reeking of gunpowder and cheap pipe tobacco. He put no stock in ghosts. He immediately assembled a posse of 6 men armed with rifled muskets, dragging Hosea, Linus, and Caspian along as they rode hard back toward that gray expanse of timber. They scoured the area relentlessly. By the 3rd day of the hunt, the weeping chill of the deep woods had seeped into their marrow, numbing the toes inside their waterlogged leather boots, and then they found the mule. It was tethered to an ancient oak, roughly a mile off the timberline, but situated on a ridge entirely deviated from the route to Fayetteville. The beast was still alive. More chillingly, its coat had been brushed to a lustrous shine, impossibly clean amidst the freezing mud. The 2 leather saddlebags remained untouched. Inside lay the surveyor's chain, the transit, the woolen bedroll, and the notebook. The notebook had not been carelessly tossed aside. It was wrapped with excruciating care in a piece of pristine white linen, entirely free of dust or dirt. And bound around that linen, tied into a flawless bow, was a strip of dark blue ribbon. When Hosea Trant saw that ribbon under the gray light filtering through the canopy, his face drained to the color of a bloated corpse. He recognized it. It was the ribbon Tabitha, his wife, used to hem patched garments. He spurred his horse back home and ransacked his wife's sewing box. A length of blue ribbon had been snipped away. Tabitha was entirely oblivious. She had never taken the box out of the house, nor had she cut any ribbon for anyone. The revelation asphyxiated the air in the room. On that agonizingly long night when Hosea whispered the blood records of Winslow, when they were all convinced they were safely fortified indoors. Something had been standing right there in their living room. It had stood in the dark, leisurely snipped a length of ribbon, and carried it off to package the remainder of Obadiah Kestrel's existence. The posse, fueled by the hot blood of armed men, resolved to push deeper. They found the packed dirt path. They stepped onto it. They counted their paces, 1,412 paces. The clearing containing the 6 log cabins ought to have materialized, but it did not. The path simply slithered onward, cavernous and black, coiling deeper into the hollow like the bottomless intestine of the earth. 2,000 paces. The canopy overhead began to interlock, weaving together to completely confiscate the sunlight, mutating the day into a foul twilight reeking of mildew and rotting foliage. 3,000 paces. 4,000 paces. The men's breathing grew frantic. The sound of their boot heels striking the earth echoed with a hollow clack within a totally hermetic void. No birds, no wind, only the smooth, merciless path stretching into infinity. At the 4th and pace mark, a deputy named Reuben Carty, the most seasoned tracker hired out of Madison County to lead the way, abruptly halted. He calmly dropped his weight onto a rotting log barring the path and laid his rifle across his thighs. The air was freezing, yet sweat beaded on his forehead, dripping down onto the muzzle. In a voice as flat and dead as a stagnant pond, Reuben announced that he would not take another step, and if Marshal Crowder attempted to force him, he would blow the marshal's brains out. Crowder glared at the tracker. "What the hell are you seeing that we aren't, Carty?" Reuben pointed at the earth beneath the toe of his boot. "The path. Look at it real close, Marshal." Marshal Crowder bent down, and what he saw was subsequently documented in the trembling report submitted to the county authorities. Upon that slick, packed dirt lay countless footprints, but they were not solely pointed forward. The prints traveled in both directions, and the detail that made Crowder's stomach violently clench with nausea was this: the footprints facing outward, heading back toward the beginning of the trail, were the freshest. They overlapped the very boot tracks the posse had just stamped into the dirt moments ago. While they had been exhausting themselves marching into the belly of the woods, many people had been casually strolling right behind them, silently tailing them, only to turn around and head back out to lock the jaws of the trap. They turned and fled. The concept of space once again bludgeoned them with ultimate mockery. The trek out took exactly 1,412 paces, flawless distance. The forest had let them go. It had simply unfolded a crease in reality, shoved them inside for a while to play with them, and then spat them out without allowing them so much as a glimpse of the village or of Obadiah. Obadiah Kestrel evaporated entirely from the face of the earth. His body was never recovered, his coat was never found, nor was the pocket watch his wife had gifted him on their wedding day, nor was a single fragment of bone ever unearthed. He had dissolved into the gray chaos of the Devil's Den, converted into the next batch of raw material for those wrinkles that would never experience the mercy of aging. Caspian Vellum abandoned the surveying trade immediately. The young man retreated into the clamor of St. Louis, burying himself amidst paved streets and glaring gaslights to hide from the dark. He lived for another 41 years. But the forest never truly relinquished him. Caspian's sister, following his death from pneumonia in 1922, penned a letter to the County Historical Society. She recounted that, for the entirety of those 41 years, precisely on the night of October 26th, her brother would remain wide awake. He would sit in his armchair, clutching a loaded rifle, forbidding anyone in the house from closing their eyes until the sun crested the horizon. In his final days, when the fever cooked his meninges and the boundary between reality and hallucination dissolved, Caspian repeatedly begged his sister to count numbers, to count out loud, to count until she reached 1/12. She also mentioned a small wooden box kept upon his writing desk. Inside it lay a strip of dark blue ribbon. Once a year, on that sleepless night, Caspian would extract the ribbon, stroke its smooth surface, and stare at it under the dying light, as if he were confronting a milky white eye piercing through time itself. She had buried that ribbon with him, believing he wished to keep it close, but she did not realize that the ribbon was an eternal shackle, chaining her brother's soul to a distant packed dirt yard. Years bled away, and the claws of civilization gouged into the Ozarks. Devil's Den was christened a state park. The caverns were mapped, trail markers were planted, parking lots were paved in concrete. Yet the phantom of the truth patiently kept to the shadows. In 1934, a topographical surveyor for the civilian conservation, named Wendell Locke, was dispatched to map the western fringe of the park, a sector that had never been logged. Amidst the silence of the afternoon timber, he raised his camera and snapped a photograph. Wendell saw nothing with his naked eye. But 3 weeks later, in a dark room reeking of chemicals in Little Rock, beneath a blood-red bulb and sloshing developing fluid, the horror manifested. In the photograph, wedged in the void between two colossal oak trunks, stood a silhouette, blurred by distance but unmistakably upright. The figure was small, pallid, and distinguished by a sprawling beard that cascaded past its chest. Wendell, his hands trembling violently, developed the next 2 plates taken on that same day, from the same roll, spaced mere minutes apart at slightly shifted angles. In both of those plates, hovering in different voids between the timber, were other silhouettes, the exact same long beards, the exact same lethal stillness they had never left. They had merely retreated into the woodwork, patiently standing by to watch the men of the 20th century pace back and forth, surveying their own tomb. Wendell Locke panicked. He placed the most blurred, indecipherable negative at the very top of the file, deliberately burying the 2 crystalline plates at the bottom. He requested an immediate transfer and vowed never to set foot in that territory again. Today, those 2 clear negatives have grown wings and vanished from the government archives. Only the most obscure photograph remains, filed away in the vaults of the Arkansas State Historical Society, a smeared, ghostly speck of light among the roots, but if you examine it from the proper angle, you will see 2 pale gray dots staring intently back at you. The notebook of Obadiah Kestrel currently resides in a dust-choked cardboard box in the basement of the Washington County Historical Office. It is never placed on display. Devil's Den is now awash with laughter. Thousands of families drive there every autumn, spreading checkered blankets on the grass, grilling meat, walking their dogs, and collecting tarnished copper leaves to press into the pages of books. They trample over the very earth that once swallowed those who did not belong, clinging to an arrogant, blind faith that concrete and coordinate markers have successfully domesticated nature. But the denizens of Devil's Den were there before this soil was ever branded America. And the most brutal truth young Linus ever derived before fleeing this country was this: they will remain there far longer than the existence of our civilization. When the skyscrapers crumble, when the maps are incinerated, they will still be standing amongst those ancient trees, chewing stewed apples devoid of salt, armed with an infinite patience. They do not hate humanity. They do not covet our world. They merely view us as a fragile supply of raw materials, blindly fumbling our way into the maw of the funnel. Before I close this file tonight, I have one question for you. Cast your mind back to that mute night beside the dying embers, when the old man with the faintly glowing eyes emerged from the darkness, cradling something against his chest and tenderly stroking it. What, in God's name, was that thing? Caspian preferred to take that secret to his grave rather than commit it to paper. A deformed infant birthed from darkness and despair, a still pulsing appendage of the doomed surveyors who came before, or a gelatinous, malevolent entity resting entirely beyond the imaginative capacity of human biology. Give me your theories down in the comments. Do not hold back on the most deranged pathological deductions you can muster, for I will read every single one, and the most spine-chilling comment, the one that bores deepest into the human psyche. I will pin it right at the top. Thank you for listening to tonight's file. Do not forget to leave a subscribe if you want me to keep excavating these rotting, shadowed corners that the masses want you to forget. Until then, beware of the low-lying hollows choked with fog. And if you ever accidentally set foot upon a packed dirt trail you never knew existed, please count. Remember to precisely count your paces on the way in, because a few of those steps will determine whether you are permitted to walk back out.